Wheel of Genre, the show for readers who've got a great deal for you on Cutco knives. Right now we are reading every short story in the Weird anthology, including this one, Margaret St. Clair's The Man Who Sold Rope to the Gnoles. I'm Zach, and this week I'm really interested in, I guess, tone, humor, levity, parody, dare I say, how this fits in aesthetically with all the other stories that we've read in this anthology.
I'm Bob. I'm excited to read a story that's not going to lead me to say something stupid like the geometry of weird. I really want to talk about door-to-door sales in this because I thought that was great. But I think what's really interesting, too, is we've read before Lord Dunsany's story about the Gnoles, and that's he's the inventor of the Gnoles, as far as I know. And now we have a story retelling the Gnoles, but we have someone not trying to rob them. I guess they kind of try to rob them, but they're going to go and sell rope to these Gnoles.
Absolutely. It's a great setup. But before we talk about the story, Bob, what do we know about Margaret St. Clair?
So Margaret St. Clair, I think she wrote 130 stories, I believe. She started reading weird tales when I think she was 12 years old and just kept reading these stories and started publishing really early. She was super prolific. She did a story called The Gardener in 1949, which sounds a lot like Clark Ashton Smith, Genius Loci. Do you remember the story with the man-eating pond? She did a story similar to that. She has a master's in classics. She was a Wiccan. She traveled a lot. And then let's see, what else was really great about? Oh yes, apparently her husband, I think it says her husband, was the American writer of children's stories about bears. He was the number one bear story writer because he wrote 100 stories about bears. But anyway, so an
How
interesting
much could you have
partner
to say about bears?
I know.
Today,
quite a
honey.
bit, apparently. Tomorrow.
Honey again.
Yeah, I guess that's it. honey again. So she is.
Well, I read that she can be considered a peripheral member of the gang of writers commonly called the Lovecraft Circle. So I guess she was in communication with Clark Ashton Smith, who's maybe someone who's more in that Lovecraft Circle, but you can find correspondences with him collected in books. So
she's involved. She's a huge fan of his too, and she wrote into Weird Tales to say, like, look, this author sucks, but you need to always publish Clark Ashton. So he's the best. Two very different opinions on the same book, Zach. I wanted to mention this because she has a book called The Sound of the Labrys, and it's famous because it's referenced in Dungeons and Dragons in what's called Appendix N. So Vintage SF, he said, not a good book, 3 out of 10, and he wasn't really sure why it's included in the Appendix N. But there's lots of books that we've seen before. I mean, The Hobbit, of course, is included in there. Lots of Lord Dunsany. Let's see, Fritz Leiber is included in there. Lovecraft, A. Merritt. So lots of artists, writers that we have read from the Weird are in this Appendix N, which is supposed to be the many books that are really important for Dungeons and Dragons, some of the inspirations. But another reviewer said, Disshelved by Adam White, he said that it's in Appendix N because she kind of came up with this idea of the dungeon delve, so going further and further into a dungeon and finding a new challenge at every level of the dungeon. So she's really important as far as the kind of the feeling, I guess, of Dungeons and Dragons has been subtly shaped by her.
That's really interesting because we read in Robert E. Howard's Conan stories, we read very similar dungeon delves. You know what I mean? The Tower of the Elephant, for example, when he has to break into a tower, and get around some booby traps, and gets betrayed, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think we called out the very dungeon crawling feel of that story. So, but it's interesting because you never really think about that as having been invented, of having a tradition or a history. It's just a form that we take for granted. Of course, you crawl the dungeon. What else do? You solve puzzles. Zelda's been around since at least the 1500s, says my mind. Anyways, so that's interesting to hear that she had a major part in shaping that tradition. That's cool. I'll tell you one thing I read. I was reading about her full length novels, not her short stories. And I was reading that we talk a lot about how like authors have themes or kind of like motifs that kind of can characterize a lot of their work. Philip K. Dick, for example, he has these recurring ideas about the fundamental irreality of reality itself, or maybe how there's someone in control on a separate reality that's kind of, making everything happen here in our world. Well, what I was reading about Margaret St. Clair is in her stories, you can find these protagonists who believe that they are acting for one reason or another. The story that the protagonist in is one thing or another. But there's a reveal that happens in a number of her stories where the protagonists don't actually understand themselves. They don't understand who they are. And the story is a very different thing. So it's like an identity reveal of the protagonist himself, where they didn't realize that everything about them has changed, and the meaning of everything they've done before is also changed because of that. And it got me thinking about this story, because like, can a similar movement be said to happen here? We have a guy who is straight out of I Love Lucy. You know what I mean? He's an American mid-century salesman, and he's looking for new customers. It feels like something out of a classic television show or something. So he decides to go to the fantasy monsters, basically. He goes off map. He goes off world. And I think part of the fun of this story is the disconnect between his expectation of, how this will play out versus the Gnoles, I guess, context, how they operate and how they work. And it got me thinking that since he winds up being their dinner, does a similar transformation happen here? Is this a case of the protagonist not realizing what story they are actually in? He's in the Gnoles story. The Gnoles aren't in his story,
The poor guy, he thinks he's doing the right thing too. He has his textbook. What is it called? It's called the Manual of Modern Salesmanship, and he really hypes himself up. And he's like, okay, I've read it. I know what I'm going to do. I know what I need to look at. And when he enters the Gnoles place, he's like, okay, they don't have normal ears. Maybe they can't hear. The Gnole sticks its tongue out. He says, okay, that's also not normal. The Gnoles apparently can't talk. And he says, adaptability. Adaptability will be my watchword. And so when he's going in, the Gnoles offer him, they have all of these emeralds. It's the same reason from the Lord Dunsany story. They have all of these gemstones. People want to go and steal them. But here, he thinks that he's selling them rope, and the Gnoles think, okay, we're going to pay you in an emerald. And the Gnole gives him a little teeny tiny emerald. And he's like, oh my God, you could ransom the Rockefellers with this. I'm not going to just take this rare emerald. So he puts it back. And he makes a terrible decision, which he thinks is the right thing. He thinks that he's adapting. He thinks he's being a good salesman who has read up on the Gnoles. And he does think that he's being stupid, but he thinks he's being smart. And I think that is the sad thing about this poor guy getting gobbled up at the end.
Yeah. And I don't even know if he thinks he's being smart. He thinks he's being ethical too, right?
Yeah, he thinks he's being ethical.
He's like, I won't cheat them out of this. I'll just take their, what do they call it?
It's the extra eyes, the false eyes.
Extra eyes. Yeah, I wasn't sure what that was. I did some reading around. I presume that it's eyeglasses. Is it eyeglasses? I don't know.
They just put emeralds in their eyes. That's what I'm imagining.
Oh my God. But it's supposed to be something that's actually worth the price of that rope, but it turns out it has sentimental value, I guess is what a salesman would call it to the Gnoles.
Yeah, because they get really upset if you go after their false eyes, and it's like an affront to them because they would rather be turned into a human, which is terrible to them, than to lose their false eyes, their emerald eyes.
So this story was funny. I think we can agree with that. This was a laugher.
This is a laugher. Earlier you were saying that she wrote a lot about people who find out that what they thought was not really the truth. They're surprised. There's a twist at the end. I heard too when she was writing science fiction and it didn't often go well, or people said that they didn't like this, or she was talking down to them, but she would put characters using machines that were far beyond their understanding of them. So they would be using like some sort of home machine that is like using rocket science, and they'd say ho ho and just press the button, but they'd have no idea what's happening to it. And so she liked this idea of the twist of also society going so far past humans that you just are so out of your league, you never really know what's going on around you. And it feels like you said, this guy, he goes in, we think he's going to do a pretty good job. He tells us all of these things he's learned from his book. He's going to pull out all the stops. He's a great salesman. He's going to get the new sale. He's going to impress his boss. That's all he wants. And when he goes into this fantasy land, it's not just that he can't hack it. It's that he is in the wrong genre altogether.
Yeah, and I like how we learn that he's in the wrong genre through a shifting setting. So like, let me read this. There's this movement from the kind of mid-century modern to the Victorian. Like the physical environment matches the characters who he's interacting with. So it says, the Gnoles live on the very edge of terra cognita, which, the known world. They live on the edge of the known world. On the far side of a wood, which all authorities unite in describing as dubious. Their house is narrow and high, in architecture a blend of Victorian Gothic and Swiss chalet. So there's a sense in which like he's telling us everything we need to know, that we're not just going to a different place per se. We seem to be stepping into a different time, a time in which Lord Dunsany is still writing or writing about. You know what I mean? Like we're truly headed to the fantasy land here, the land of fairy.
When someone enters the land of fairy, do you have to be smarter than the average bear? Do you have to have your wits really about you to survive the land of fairy? What happens if you get too infatuated with it and you can't get out of it? He's not portrayed as the smartest character ever, but when he goes in, he wants to sell the rope. There are already lots of red flags. The Gnoles, you probably shouldn't mess with the Gnoles in the first place. It's really dark. The only light comes from the glint of the emeralds. But then also as he's like pulling the rope out and he says, oh, I know the Gnoles go through a lot of rope. I don't ask questions what they use it for. But then it says here, the senior Gnole watched him intently, putting his little feet on the top run of his chair and poking at the facets of his left eye now and then with a tentacle. In the cellars, from time to time, someone would scream. And then he just takes out another kind of rope and he shows them this. Like, is this a trope of not just going into fairy and being out of your league, but is it a trope of being someone in a horror story and just not taking red flags?
Yeah, it reminds me of that movie Barbarian, where Justin Long discovers the torture basement in his house that he owns. And, instead of recognizing that it's the torture basement, he goes down there and he starts measuring the floor plan so that he could raise the prices for his Airbnb. Just a total like cluelessness of like what genre the story has just entered. It's a very similar kind of humor, I think. And
so if this is, entering the wrong, you're not adhering to the genre rules, or you're not listening to the genre rules. What do you think about someone making a parody or continuing this legend that Lord Dunsany, kind of the godfather, the grandfather of weird fiction, taking that and then running with it in a way? Is it a parody? Is it like Justin Long? Or is it somehow participating in a way that honors the original weird?
That's a really good question. And that's kind of what I was struggling with myself. Because, one thing to consider is, if you are doing exactly what Lord Dunsany did, if you are just writing a cheap copy of Lord Dunsany, is that really homage? You know what I mean? Like, is that, they say imitation is the highest form of flattery, but like if I was in Dunsany's shoes, I would be more excited to have people use my characters, use my world in their own style and carry on that tradition, rather than just have a bunch of like mini-me's running around doing bad versions of Dunsany. I don't know. What do you think?
I think the way that she has the style is very fun. It's a fun story, and the way that she has turned it around. So no longer are we trying to steal from the Gnoles. Now we're trying to sell from the Gnoles. I think that is funny enough to get permission to do a very similar story. And I think it's fun to, before we never really got to see the Gnoles. She's kind of invented what the Gnoles really look like here. We get hints, but they're just living in the knobbly nooks of the trees, and grabbing out, taking people away. Now it's so weird that nightmarish creature that just is something in the dark. Now we go to its house and we see its weird emerald eyes. Its eyes are out and it's just buying rope. I think that is fun to do.
The interesting thing about Lord Dunsany's work is that it would often be prompted by an illustration given to him by Sidney Syme. And the Gnoll story is really no different. And you can see in that illustration, just like the hint of the Gnoll. I'm going to put it up on the screen and you guys can see it. But I'm pretty sure, just working off of memory right now, tentacles were not part of that original idea of what a Gnoll is. I think it's ambiguous in the text, but if my memory serves, there's no tentacles in the original drawing. I can see you're looking it up right now, so maybe we'll just cut this whole part. But I just thought that the inclusion of the tentacled Gnoll, I'm not saying it's wrong, I'm saying it's reflective of a post-Lovecraftian weird fiction universe.
I'm thinking the exact same thing. I'm looking through all of our notes here, Zach, but if anyone else can remember, I was surprised by the tentacles for sure in this story, and I feel like they were not in the original one. Maybe? I tracked down a little bit of a quote that I found from last time. Zach. It says, but the Gnoles, this is from the Dunsany story, but the Gnoles had watched him through knavish holes that they bore in trunks of the trees, and the unearthly silence gave way, as it were, with a grace to the rapid screams of Tonker as they picked him up from behind. So I don't think we get tentacles there, but at least we get something stretching and reaching out. So I think she's making a logical leap.
I'm just calling it that Lovecraft did a number on the American imagination after he dropped
the tentacle.
The tentacle. Speaking of tentacles, I am in the mood to get some sushi. So I will talk to you later, Bob.
Never mind. Talk to you later, Zach.